Summary: The Courage to be Disliked, Ichiro Kishimi. Book link. Click here. The philosopher believes the world is simple and happiness is within everyone's reach. The youth finds the world chaotic and contradictory, and happiness absurd. He visits the philosopher to debate this. The philosopher says the world only seems complicated because we make it so. We each live in our own subjective world. He illustrates this with the example of well water seeming cool in summer and warm in winter, though its temperature remains the same. Our experience depends on us, not the world itself. The philosopher says the youth sees the world darkly, as through dark glasses. He could change how he sees the world by removing those glasses, if he has the courage. The philosopher believes people can change and find happiness. The youth is skeptical but interested in the discussion. The young man argues that people cannot change because there are always reasons, or causes, in their past that determine who they become. He cites the example of his friend who has become a recluse due to past trauma or experiences. The philosopher counters that if the past fully determines the present, then everyone with a similar past would end up the same. This view leads to determinism, where the future is fixed. Instead, the philosopher proposes that Adlerian psychology focuses on present goals rather than past causes. The reasons behind behavior lie in what people are aiming for now, not what happened before. The young man objects that there must be some explanation or reason for his friend's condition. The philosopher argues that according to Adlerian psychology, the friend is choosing not to go out in order to achieve a goal of insecurity. The past is not determining the present. In summary, the key disagreement is whether the past shapes who we are, the young man's view, or whether our present goals and choices shape who we are becoming, the philosopher's view based on Adlerian psychology. This shapes their views on whether people can change. According to Adlerian psychology, anxiety and fear are created by a person to achieve a goal, like not going out. The symptoms and suffering are real but stem from the meaning we give experiences, not the experiences themselves. Trauma does not exist. We determine our lives by the meaning we give experiences, not the experiences themselves. Nothing actually determines who we become. The youth's friend likely stays in his room to get attention from his parents. He created anxiety and fear as reasons to stay inside to achieve this goal. Though not happy, he is taking action in line with this goal. Anger is also created to achieve a goal, like making someone submit. The emotion comes before the behavior. We fabricate emotions like anger to justify behavior, but we are responsible for that behavior. The youth shouted at the waiter to make him submit, not because he couldn't control his anger. Anger seems instantaneous but can be turned on and off to suit our purposes. The mother turned off her anger when the teacher called, showing she was in control of that emotion. In summary, according to Adler, we are not determined by experiences or emotions. We fabricate emotions and give experiences meaning to suit our life goals and purposes. Anxiety, fear, anger, and other emotions are within our control and used as tools to get what we want. Trauma has no influence over who we become. We are wholly responsible for our choices and behaviors. The story describes a mother who suddenly switches from yelling angrily at her daughter to having a polite phone conversation. The philosopher says this shows that the mother's anger is a tool she uses when needed to assert control, not an uncontrollable emotion. The youth accuses the philosopher of being nihilistic because he views emotions as merely tools to achieve goals, rather than integral parts of our humanity. The philosopher disagrees and says he is not denying emotions, just that people are not controlled by them. He follows Adlerian psychology, which says people are not determined by either emotions or their pasts. The philosopher argues that while we can't change the past, we can change its meaning and effect on us now by how we view it. If we remain stuck in the past, ideology, we end up pessimistic and hopeless. But if we believe people can change, teleology, we stay optimistic and forward-looking. The youth questions whether he could become radically different, like his charismatic friend Y. The philosopher says not without first understanding Adlerian psychology. He compares Adler and Socrates as philosophers who conveyed ideas through dialogue, not books. The youth agrees to engage in philosophical dialogue. The youth argues that personalities are fixed, so gaining knowledge or understanding theories like Adler's won't change someone's core self. The philosopher counters that the youth really just wants to change because he doesn't currently love himself. But instead of trying to become someone else, he should learn self-acceptance while also striving to improve. The philosopher admits few people truly like themselves, but says he at least accepts who he is. He tells the youth it's okay to be himself, but not to remain just as he is. He needs to keep progressing and improving to find happiness. The meaning seems to be that self-acceptance and self-improvement go hand in hand. The philosopher argues that unhappiness is a choice. One chooses to focus on circumstance one is born into rather than focusing on self-improvement. The youth disagrees, arguing that some people are born into unfortunate circumstances while others have advantages. Unhappiness can stem from birth. The philosopher counters that no one desires evil or unhappiness for its own sake. Rather, people justify their choices as benefiting themselves in some way. The youth chose unhappiness at some point because he saw it as good for him. The philosopher explains that in Adlerian psychology, one's lifestyle refers to how one sees the world and oneself. It is chosen, not inborn. The youth argues he did not consciously choose his personality. The philosopher says the initial choice of lifestyle is often unconscious, influenced by environment and upbringing. But since it is chosen, it can be rechosen. The youth asks how to re-choose. The philosopher says people can change at any time but choose not to. The youth says he wants to change but can't. The philosopher says the youth is choosing not to change because his current lifestyle, though imperfect, is familiar and predictable, while a new one would be anxiety-provoking and uncertain. In summary, the philosopher is arguing that one's unhappiness and personality are the result of choices, not fate, and can be changed by making the choice to view oneself and the world differently, though this choice is often difficult due to the uncertainty and fear of change. The philosopher argues that the young man dislikes himself by choice because it gives him some kind of advantage. The young man lists various shortcomings about his personality, appearance, and behavior that make him dislike himself. The philosopher points out that dwelling on one's shortcomings puts one in an unpleasant mood. To illustrate, the philosopher shares an example of a female student who came to him concerned about her fear of blushing in public. When asked what she would do if she could cure her blushing, she said she had feelings for a man but wasn't ready to express them yet. The philosopher suggests that her fear of blushing and the young man's self-dislike both serve to avoid risks in relationships. All problems stem from interpersonal relationships, and people create psychological problems to avoid facing risks in relationships. The summary is that the philosopher believes the young man chooses to dislike himself to avoid risks in relationships. Psychological problems are created as excuses to avoid interpersonal relationship issues. The young man's self-dislike and the woman's fear of blushing are examples of this. The client, a young woman, sought counseling to cure her fear of blushing so that she could confess her feelings to a man she desired. However, the philosopher argues that her fear of blushing served an important psychological purpose for her. Specifically, it allowed her to avoid confronting the possibility of rejection by the man. As long as she had this fear, she could tell herself that she would confess her feelings if only she could overcome the fear, thus avoiding putting herself in a vulnerable position. The philosopher explains that many people create obstacles or excuses to avoid facing difficult life challenges or confrontations. The fear is a symptom, not the real issue. The real issue is a lack of self-confidence and fear of vulnerability. The philosopher says he would not directly cure her fear of blushing. Instead, he would help build her self-confidence through encouragement so she could face the possibility of rejection, regardless of the outcome. The story ends with the man actually confessing his own feelings for her, suggesting she overcame her fear, but the details are left unknown. The discussion then turns to the client's own issues. The philosopher argues that the client dislikes himself and focuses on his flaws as an excuse to avoid interpersonal relationships and vulnerability. The client acknowledges this is true. The philosopher explains that some degree of hurt is inevitable in relationships, so avoiding them altogether is unrealistic. He reiterates that all problems are interpersonal relationship problems, meaning psychological and life difficulties arise from and revolve around our connections with others. However, the client pushes back on this extreme position, arguing that humans also grapple with deeper existential problems, not just interpersonal ones. The philosopher acknowledges this but maintains that human existence is socially constructed and internally focused worries still relate to our relationships. In summary, the key points are, fear and obstacles are often symptoms, not the real issues. The real issues involve underlying psychological motivations and life challenges. Building self-confidence and courage is more helpful than removing the symptoms. This allows people to face difficulties and vulnerability. Hurt and difficulty in relationships are inevitable parts of human existence. Avoiding relationships altogether is unrealistic and unfulfilling. While humans do struggle with deep existential questions, social relations shape human experience and psychology. Internal experiences still relate to our interactions and connections with others. Encouragement and helping build self-confidence are more effective for counseling than directly treating surface symptoms alone. The philosopher argues that feelings of inferiority arise from subjective interpretations and assumptions, not objective facts. Our judgments about our own worth and value depend on the context of our interpersonal relationships and social comparisons. Without these comparisons, we would have no reason to feel inferior. The value we attribute to things is also subjective and depends on social context. For example, the value of money or diamonds depends on what society attributes to them, not their objective worth. While everyone experiences feelings of inferiority, they are not problems in themselves and can even motivate self-improvement. They become problematic only when misused or exaggerated. The desire to overcome helplessness and improve oneself, what Adler called the pursuit of superiority, leads to feelings of inferiority when one fails to reach one's ideals. But these feelings can fuel further growth and progress. An inferiority complex refers to the exaggerated or misuse of normal feelings of inferiority as an excuse. It is a choice, not an objective condition. The philosopher argues against seeing inferiority feelings as objective or trivial. They are subjective, ubiquitous, and can be motivationally useful or problematic depending on how we think about them. An inferiority complex represents a problematic way of thinking that excuses stagnation rather than fuels progress. Overall, the philosopher suggests our interpretations and assumptions are key to overcoming unhelpful feelings of inferiority. There is nothing inherently wrong with feelings of inferiority. They can motivate growth and progress. However, an inferiority complex refers to using feelings of inferiority as an excuse, for example, I can't succeed because I'm not well educated. This is an apparent cause and effect fallacy. No one can tolerate strong feelings of inferiority for long. There are two main ways people compensate: healthy striving and growth. Putting in effort to improve the lacking area. An unhealthy superiority complex. Fabricating a feeling of superiority to mask the inferiority. Examples: giving authority, associating with powerful people to feel special by proxy. Boasting, constantly talking about past achievements to seem superior. But this actually shows a lack of real confidence. Those with superiority complexes are living according to others' standards, not their own authentic selves. The root cause of a superiority complex is still a strong underlying feeling of inferiority. The superiority is a facade. In summary, accept feelings of inferiority as normal and use them to fuel healthy progress. Don't develop an inferiority or superiority complex, which are unhealthy ways to avoid uncomfortable feelings. With courage and effort, you can overcome either complex. The philosopher explains that while the pursuit of superiority, aiming to improve oneself, is universal and healthy, excessive feelings of inferiority and superiority are problematic. Life should not be viewed as a competition where one needs to compare themselves to others. People are different but equal. One should focus on progressing themselves rather than trying to be superior to others. The youth has trouble accepting this view, thinking competition is necessary for motivation and growth. The philosopher argues that while competition with comrades can lead to self-improvement, often competitors are not comrades, leading to interpersonal problems. If one views all relationships as competitive, they will feel like either a winner or loser, causing distress. One should not focus so much on competition and how they appear to others. In summary, the philosopher argues for viewing life not as a competition where one must compare themselves to others, but instead focusing on self-improvement and viewing others as equals despite differences. Excessive focus on competition often leads to feelings of inferiority and distress in relationships. Summary: the key idea is that when one is conscious of competition and comparing oneself to others, it breeds feelings of inferiority and causes one to see others as enemies. This leads to an unhappy life filled with distrust and fear. In contrast, releasing oneself from a competitive mindset allows one to see others as comrades and celebrate their happiness, leading to more positive relationships and outlook. The youth argues that his feelings of inferiority arose inevitably from his upbringing and parents constantly comparing him unfavorably to his brother. However, the philosopher argues that rather than attributing causes to the past, etiology, one should focus on finding meaning in the present, teleology. While the past cannot be changed, how one interprets it and attributes meaning to it can be changed. The youth also argues that emotions like anger are inevitable and not fabricated. However, the philosopher distinguishes between personal anger arising from grudges and indignation over social injustices. Personal anger is a tool for gaining power over others, while righteous indignation aims beyond oneself. The philosopher argues that even personal attacks can reflect an attempt by the other person to engage in a power struggle, where the goal is to prove one's power by winning. The key is to not engage in these power struggles and remain detached from personal grudges and anger. In summary, the key arguments are: a competitive mindset breeds unhappiness and fear, while a cooperative mindset enables joy for others and better relationships. One's interpretation of past events, not the events themselves, determines their meaning and influence. Focus on the present, not attributing blame to the past. Personal anger and grudges stem from a desire for power and control over others. Do not engage in power struggles or respond to provocation with anger. The overall message is that releasing oneself from competitive and angry mindsets can lead to a more positive life with healthier relationships. One must find meaning through present choice, not past circumstance. The other person's goal in personally attacking or provoking you is not to have a political discussion but rather to criticize, provoke and defeat you in a power struggle. Do not engage in the power struggle or get angry. This will only lead to further retaliation and revenge. Respond without reaction and step down from the conflict. Anger is a form of communication and a means to an end. You can convey your thoughts without anger. Learn to do this and anger will cease appearing. Do not think in terms of being right in interpersonal relationships. This leads to seeing the other as wrong and turns the interaction into a power struggle over who will win. Correctness of assertions is separate from winning and losing. Admitting mistakes and apologizing is not defeat. Pursuing superiority is not done through competing with others. The focus on winning and losing clouds judgment and leads one down the wrong path. Remove the lens of competition to correct yourself. Interpersonal relationships are crucial because life's objectives are to be self-reliant and live in harmony with society. The psychology to support this is believing in one's ability and seeing others as comrades. Life tasks refer to the challenges of growing up, becoming independent from one's parents, engaging in meaningful work and developing friendships. Facing these tasks leads to achieving life's objectives. Running from them leads to seeing others as enemies. In summary, do not engage in power struggles and anger, see others as comrades not competitors, face life's challenges to achieve well-being and believe in your ability. This will lead to self-reliance, harmony with others and overcoming inferiority. Alfred Adler identified 3 core types of interpersonal relationships that individuals must confront. Tasks of work. These involve cooperative relationships formed to achieve a common goal, like in a workplace. These tend to be more superficial since the relationship mainly revolves around the task. Those who struggle in these relationships may become neets or shut-ins to avoid them. Tasks of friendship. These involve personal friendships formed outside of work or school. These relationships are challenging to initiate and deepen but important for well-being. The number of friends is less important than the depth of the relationships. Tasks of love. These involve love relationships and family relationships, especially between parents and children. Romantic relationships can be difficult because of jealousy and distrust, but true love relationships allow partners to feel free and natural together. Parent-child relationships are bound like rigid chains and difficult to escape, so one must confront them even if distressing. The key to managing interpersonal relationships is to change oneself rather than try to change others. One should not avoid or delay dealing with challenging relationships. Although individuals need self-reliance, they also need cooperation within relationships to develop a sense of self. The ability to achieve intimacy in relationships while maintaining a sense of equality and freedom is the goal. The philosopher explains that Adlerian psychology focuses on courage and freedom of choice, not morality or determinism. The youth is struggling to overcome his inferiority complex and life lies that make him put off life tasks like work, friendship, and love. The philosopher says that Freudian psychology is about possession what one is born with, but Adlerian psychology is about use the choices one makes. Money provides a limited kind of freedom, the philosopher says, but true freedom comes from overcoming psychological constraints. Even with money, one may lack meaningful relationships and be trapped in unwanted bonds. The philosopher says the youth should stop seeking recognition from others and instead pursue his own interests and values. By choosing one's path courageously and freely, one can find purpose and meaning. The key ideas are, Adlerian psychology emphasizes courage, freedom of choice, and overcoming life lies and inferiority complexes. True freedom comes from within, not from material possessions or money. Psychological freedom comes from pursuing one's own interests and values, not seeking recognition or approval from others. Finding purpose and meaning in life requires the courage to choose one's own path freely. Interpersonal relationships are inescapable aspects of human existence, but they can interfere with one's freedom and autonomy. Parent-child relationships are complicated because parents are not exactly enemies but their expectations and demands can put pressure on their children. The desire to gain parents' recognition and acceptance is natural but can be problematic. According to Adlerian psychology, one should not seek recognition from others or live to satisfy others' expectations. Doing so leads to mistaken lifestyles and unhealthy psychological dependence on what others think. One should live for oneself, not for satisfying others or meeting their expectations. Ultimately, we each live our own lives. If we only care about gaining others' recognition, we end up living their lives rather than our own. However, some argue that desire for recognition is natural and mutual recognition is necessary for society to function. Gaining recognition requires first recognizing others. Not caring about others' recognition could promote isolation and conflict. There are debates around whether God's recognition can replace human recognition and whether nihilism necessarily follows from denying the need for human recognition. Living for oneself rather than for gaining others' recognition may be necessary to overcome nihilism. In summary, interpersonal relationships inevitably shape human existence but should not dictate how one lives one's own life. Gaining autonomy and living according to one's own values may require limiting one's dependence on gaining recognition and approval from others. There are complex philosophical arguments around these issues. The philosopher argues that seeking social recognition and status is not the path to happiness. While people are motivated by praise and by satisfying others' expectations, that actually makes them repress their true self and causes constant anxiety about how others see them. The philosopher introduces the concept of separation of tasks. This means recognizing that certain tasks, like a child studying or a client's life changes in counseling, ultimately belong to the child or client, not the parent or counselor. Forcing change through coercion often leads to rebellion. The parent or counselor's role should be to offer help and support, but not take over the task. Applying this to the case of a shut-in child, the philosopher says the task of changing the situation belongs to the child. The parent should not focus too intensely on intervening. But the parent should let the child know they are available to help if asked. If the parent takes over the child's task and makes the child's life their whole purpose, they lose their own sense of self. And ultimately, children become independent individuals and do not just fulfill their parents' wishes. The key point is that one should recognize which tasks belong to oneself and which belong to others, and not intrude on other people's tasks or let them intrude on your own. Doing so leads to relationship difficulties and lack of freedom or individuality. But offering help and support, when asked, can build trust and allow others to take on their own tasks. It is important to draw boundaries and separate oneself from others' tasks and expectations. Other people are living their own lives, not to satisfy your expectations. Even family members have their own agency and lives to lead. Believing in others requires separating their tasks from your own. Pushing your wishes onto others can become unhealthy intervention. Letting go of responsibility for others' emotions and judgments lightens your own load. Their reactions are their tasks, not yours. You can only choose and act for yourself. How others judge you is outside of your control. Blaming circumstances or others for your own difficulties is an excuse. Take responsibility for your own tasks. Identifying whose task something really is, and separating accordingly, can free you from unhealthy dynamics ensuing in relationships. Though counterintuitive, this approach can allow for truer connection by respecting others' freedom and agency. Rather than unraveling knotty dynamics, we may need to cut them. There is an ethical argument against separating from others in this way. However, unhealthy enmeshment and codependence also have moral consequences. A balance of connection and freedom is ideal. The key ideas are separating tasks, taking responsibility for yourself only, freeing yourself from unhealthy dynamics, and finding the right level of connection with others. The metaphor of cutting the Gordian knot illustrates resolving complex problems through bold and unconventional action. The philosopher argues that seeking recognition from others to avoid being disliked makes one unfree. Constantly trying to please everyone and gauge their feelings requires lying to oneself and others. This leads to stress, loss of trust, and a life of suffering. While it may seem easier to follow the expectations of others and let them guide your life, this is an unfree way to live that sacrifices your own desires and goals. True freedom comes from separating your own tasks from the expectations of others. Though this can lead to difficulties in finding one's path, it allows one to live according to one's own values. The youth protests that no one wants to be disliked and that the desire for recognition is natural. However, the philosopher counters that trying to please everyone is an impossible promise that leads to contradiction and harm. Parents who force their life expectations onto their children are acting in an egocentric manner. While disregarding the intentions of one's parents seems harsh, one has no obligation to live for the recognition and expectations of others. True freedom comes from separating one's own tasks and living as one chooses. In summary, the key argument is that seeking constant recognition and approval from others in order to avoid their dislike results in a lack of freedom and authenticity. Though the desire to please is natural, one must separate one's own life path from the expectations of others to achieve independence and self-direction. The separation of tasks allows one to live according to one's own values instead of sacrificing oneself to satisfy everyone else. Here is a summary of the key points of the conversation. The philosopher argues that true freedom comes from not being afraid of being disliked by others and living according to one's own principles. Merely breaking free of organizations or responsibilities is not real freedom. The desire to be liked by everyone and avoid being disliked is natural but leads to an unfree way of living where one is ruled by inclinations and impulses. True freedom comes from resisting these inclinations and pushing oneself up from below. The cost of freedom in interpersonal relationships is being willing to be disliked by others. While one does not seek to be disliked, true freedom means not fearing it and being willing to accept it. The philosopher says he chooses a life where some dislike him over a life where all like him. He wants to follow his own path, not be overly concerned with what others think. The philosopher had a troubled relationship with his father, citing memories of being physically abused as a child. However, he came to realize through Adlerian psychology that he held on to these memories because he did not actually want to repair the relationship. It was more convenient for him to blame his father and the abuse. The youth argues that even if the philosopher was able to gain this insight, it does not change the fact that the abuse happened. The philosopher acknowledges this but says one can choose to think from a different perspective. The past cannot be changed, but one's attitude toward it and its effects can be. Overall, the philosopher is arguing for an attitude of freedom that comes from within, not relying on external circumstances. True freedom is found in how one responds mentally and emotionally, not in one's physical situation. One always has a choice in how one perceives and frames one's experiences. The young man initially accepted the philosopher's idea of separating tasks as a useful way to improve interpersonal relationships. However, upon further reflection, the young man felt this idea could promote an unhealthy individualism that leads to isolation from others. The philosopher clarifies that individual psychology refers to viewing a person as an indivisible whole, not separate parts. The mind and body, reason and emotion, conscious and unconscious are interconnected. When a person acts, it is the whole person acting, not just one part like emotion. The philosopher calls this view holism. The philosopher acknowledges interpersonal relationships are the source of all problems. The concept of separating tasks aims not to isolate people but to unravel the complex entanglements in relationships by maintaining a degree of distance, though not too much. The key is finding the right balance of connection and independence. The philosopher argues that viewing mind/body, reason/emotion, conscious/unconscious as separate leads to unhealthy ways of explaining one's own behavior, like my emotions made me do it, I couldn't help it. It is always the whole person acting. Separating emotion from the self is a life lie. Overall, the philosopher clarifies that individual psychology and the idea of separating tasks should not promote isolation but rather aim to improve interpersonal relationships through gaining insight into how one's sense of self and views of others become entangled. The solution is finding the right balance of connection and separation. A holistic view of human nature is needed to achieve this insight. The interpersonal relationships we should aim for is community feeling according to Adlerian psychology. This means seeing others as comrades and finding our place of belonging with them. There are debates around Adler's concept of community as he sees it as encompassing the entire universe, past and future, not just our immediate circles. This is an unattainable ideal but still worth striving for. Interpersonal relationships are the source of both happiness and unhappiness. Community feeling is the key to happy relationships. The smallest unit of society and community is you and I. We need to shift from self-interest to concern for others. Self-centeredness means being obsessed with how others see us and desiring recognition. We worry only about ourselves, not others. Even those trying to please others can be self-centered. We are all members of a community and desire to feel like we belong. But we are not the center of the world. Self-centered people think everything revolves around them and others exist to serve them. In summary, we need to move from self-interest to community interest and seeing ourselves as part of the whole, not the center of the world. Healthy interpersonal relationships stem from this. People often have unrealistic expectations of others, and when those expectations are not met, they become resentful. But you are not the center of the world and cannot expect others to live for your satisfaction. The world is not a static map with you at the center. It is more like a globe where any place can be the center depending on your perspective. You are part of a community, not its center. To gain a sense of belonging, you must make an active commitment to your community by facing life's tasks, like work, relationships, responsibilities, not expecting what others will do for you but thinking of what you can contribute. Community feeling comes from your own efforts, not entitlement. The scope of community is infinite, extending beyond what you immediately see to include connections you cannot see. No one is truly alone or separate. Even someone isolated still belongs to and depends on a larger community. While we naturally feel a stronger sense of belonging to smaller, visible communities like a school, company or local society, we must be aware of larger communities we belong to as well. If we cannot find belonging in one community, we can look to others. The world extends far beyond any single community's walls. The key takeaway is that you belong to a larger whole, so do not make any one community the be-all and end-all. Maintain a balanced perspective and find refuge and belonging wherever you can, whether in familiar communities or outside them. No person or group is the center of the world. We are all part of an interconnected whole. Schools are small communities that you can withdraw from by submitting a notice. Once you leave, the hardships you face there will seem insignificant. Staying confined in a small community prevents you from thriving outside of it. It is difficult to withdraw from school, but you should consider the voice of the larger community. Do not cling to small communities. There are always larger communities to be a part of. Horizontal relationships are equal relationships between people that recognize differences in roles and workplaces. They are built on cooperation and harmony, unlike vertical relationships based on manipulation and judgment. Raising children and training others through rebuke, punishment, or praise, rewards, creates vertical relationships. Rebuke and praise intend to manipulate, not build cooperation. Adlerian psychology promotes horizontal relationships instead. Wanting praise shows you see relationships as unequal. Adlerian psychology rejects unequal vertical relationships in favor of equal horizontal ones, where people are equal but not the same. Feeling inferior arises from vertical relationships. Some men verbally abuse their wives to feel superior, showing their vertical view of relationships and hidden feelings of inferiority. Horizontal relationships recognize people as equals in worth, despite different life roles. Overall, the key message is that we should build horizontal relationships based on equality and cooperation, rather than rely on vertical relationships where we manipulate and judge one another. Small communities often foster the latter, so we must consider the larger perspective. Vertical relationships lead to inferiority complexes and manipulation. Horizontal relationships can eliminate these. Intervention is intruding on others' tasks and manipulating them. Assistance respects others' tasks but offers help without forcing or directing them. Encouragement builds courage through horizontal relationships. It expresses gratitude and joy rather than praise or judgment. Feeling you have worth comes from contributing to others, not from being judged as good. Contributing gives a sense of usefulness and courage. The discussion focused on community feeling, horizontal relationships, encouragement, and gaining a sense of worth through contributing to others. The main point was moving from vertical to horizontal relationships. The key message is that one needs to build horizontal relationships with others based on equality and mutual respect, rather than vertical relationships based on hierarchy and inequality. Building horizontal relationships helps one develop a true sense of self-worth. When one treats others as equals and feels useful to them, one can gain awareness of one's own value. The logics that being of use to someone gives one worth is flawed. A person's worth is not defined by their usefulness to others. All human beings have intrinsic worth simply due to their existence. Examples show how vertical relationships can undermine one's sense of worth, as one feels like a replaceable tool rather than a unique individual. In contrast, horizontal relationships recognize and value the other person for who they are. It is important to choose to build either horizontal or vertical relationships. One cannot have both simultaneously, as the vertical mindset will dominate and undermine the horizontal relationships. The key is to start by building at least one horizontal relationship. This can then spread to other relationships and enable one to gain a sense of self-worth and purpose. But this change starts with a choice to view at least one other person as an equal. The overall message is that in order to feel a true sense of worth, one must change how one views and relates to others by building mutual, respectful relationships between equals. A single horizontal relationship can be the start of this transformation. The key ideas discussed are: excessive self-consciousness and self-loathing stifle one's true self. The youth acknowledges that he suffers from excessive self-consciousness that prevents him from behaving freely and innocently. He is overly concerned about how others view him and lacks confidence in himself. The solution is not self-affirmation but self-acceptance. One must accept oneself as one is, imperfections and all, instead of constantly seeking affirmation and approval from others. Self-acceptance leads to confidence from within. Happiness lies beyond community feeling and depends on living earnestly in the present moment. One must avoid being overly attached to past regrets and future anxieties, and instead focus on living wholeheartedly right now. Courage and decisiveness are required to overcome excessive self-consciousness. While words of encouragement are not enough, one must ultimately take action and have the courage to be one's authentic self, imperfect as that may be. In summary, the key to overcoming excessive self-consciousness and finding happiness is learning self-acceptance, living earnestly in the present moment, and mustering the courage to be authentic. Focusing outward on community is not enough, one must first establish inner confidence and peace. Be yourself by gaining self-acceptance, which means accepting your inherent limitations and focusing on what you can change rather than what you cannot. This is different from self-affirmation, which involves lying to yourself. Self-acceptance leads to affirmative resignation. To move from self-interest to social interest, gain confidence in others in addition to self-acceptance. Confidence means believing in others unconditionally, not just based on trust or conditions. Though this may lead to being taken advantage of at times, unconditional confidence builds deep relationships. The opposite of confidence is doubt. Relationships built on doubt cannot thrive. Have confidence in others and focus on your own actions, not whether others will take advantage of you. Separate your tasks from others' tasks. The philosophy is not about being a naive fool or zealot. It emphasizes seeing reality clearly while having courage and fortitude. Gaining self-acceptance and confidence in others allows one to contribute to the social whole. In summary, be yourself means gain self-acceptance, have confidence in others, contribute to the community, and separate your own tasks from worrying about what others might do. This leads to social interest and community feeling. The key points are accepting yourself as you are, believing in others unconditionally, and focusing on what you can control, your own contributions and actions. This creates the basis for positive social relationships and community. Though the concepts are simple, putting them into practice requires courage. But they provide a path to gaining social interest and moving from self-centeredness to concern for others. The philosopher argues that unconditional confidence in others and self-acceptance are necessary to build deep relationships and gain a sense of belonging. However, the youth finds this argument unconvincing, especially the idea of contribution to others. If this contribution is really for other people, it seems like bitter self-sacrifice. But if it's actually for oneself, it seems hypocritical. The philosopher clarifies that contribution to others refers to work or a labor that provides value to the community, allowing one to feel useful and confirm one's worth. While making money is important, work itself gives a sense of belonging. Even wealthy people continue working to contribute and feel like they belong. The youth acknowledges work can involve contributing to others. But doing something officially for others while really benefiting oneself seems hypocritical. The philosopher needs to fully explain this point. The summary highlights the key elements of the dialogue, including the philosopher's arguments for unconditional confidence, self-acceptance and contributing to others, as well as the youth's critiques and requests for clarification. The assistant focuses on articulating the essence and logical flow of the complex ideas being discussed. The key message is that one should not make judgments about the whole based on only part of the situation. Those lacking harmony of life tend to focus on only negative aspects and generalize that to everyone and everything. For example, someone who stammers may think everyone laughs at me based on the reaction of one cruel person, even though most people are kind and patient. Similarly, a workaholic focuses only on work and judges their whole life based on that one aspect. The solution is to gain perspective and see that there are many good people and life involves more than just one's perceived flaws or one activity like work. One should accept oneself, have confidence in the goodwill of others, and contribute to the community. This leads to a balanced and fulfilling life. Blaming others or circumstances is counterproductive. Even when facing difficulties like speech issues, the root problem is often a lack of self-acceptance and community, not the difficulty itself. Gaining this balanced perspective is challenging and takes effort and time. But by starting at a young age, one has the opportunity to change in a deep and lasting way. The ideal is an attitude of harmony of life where one sees the complexity in each situation and in human nature, rather than making overly simplistic judgments. With an open and understanding perspective, life's challenges become more bearable and relationships more fulfilling. According to the philosopher, people can only truly feel a sense of self-worth when they feel like they are contributing to others in some way. This contribution does not have to be visible or concrete. It is enough to have a subjective sense of being useful to someone. The philosopher concludes that happiness comes from this feeling of making a contribution. The youth finds this definition of happiness too simplistic. All people would be happy if it were that easy. The philosopher clarifies that while all people have the capacity for happiness, not all achieve it. One must actually feel like they are contributing to others in some way. The youth asks how one can gain this feeling of contribution. The philosopher says not through seeking recognition from others. Seeking recognition from others means basing one's sense of worth on what others think, which restricts one's freedom and authenticity. True happiness comes from an internal sense of contribution, not from seeking external recognition. Once one feels they are contributing, the desire for recognition from others fades away. The philosopher believes happiness requires freedom and authenticity in one's relationships with others. So in summary, the key points are, feeling like you are contributing to others gives a sense of self-worth and happiness. This is an internal feeling, not based on seeking recognition from others. Happiness requires freedom and authenticity in relationships. The desire for recognition indicates a lack of real happiness and community feeling. The philosopher argues that there are two paths people who want to feel special often pursue: trying to be exceptionally good by excelling in studies, sports, following rules, etc. to gain approval and attention. However, when that does not work out, they do the opposite and become bad to still gain attention. This is referred to as the pursuit of easy superiority and is an unhealthy attitude. Engaging in problem behavior like delinquency, self-harm, substance abuse, etc. to gain attention and feel special. Even though the attention comes in the form of rebuke, it still satisfies the desire to feel superior without putting in real effort. This can also be a form of revenge. The philosopher argues that the healthiest path is to accept being normal and ordinary. The desire to be special often comes from not accepting one's normal self. Everyone is essentially normal, and being normal is not the same as being incapable. One does not need to flaunt one's superiority. The youth disagrees and argues that accepting a normal and mediocre life is giving up. He believes one needs lofty goals and ideals to strive for to live a meaningful life, like famous people such as Napoleon, Einstein, and Martin Luther King Jr. The philosopher counters that if life is like climbing a mountain to reach the top, most of life would be spent en route, traveling to reach the top. If one does not reach the top due to obstacles, one's life would end up being lived as a tentative life by a tentative self. This is not a satisfying way to live. In summary, the philosopher argues for accepting one's normal self and living meaningfully now rather than always striving to become special or reach some lofty future goal. The youth disagrees and believes one needs ambition and ideals to strive for to live well. The philosopher argues against viewing life as a linear progression towards a goal or a destination. Instead, he proposes viewing life as a series of moments experienced in the present. Rather than climbing a mountain to reach the top, we should live life by dancing freely in the moment. The past does not determine the present, and the future is unknowable. Focusing excessively on the past or future is a way to avoid truly living in the present moment. The youth argues against this view, saying that it precludes purposeful action and planning. Without goals or direction, life becomes aimless and drifting. The philosopher responds that living in the present moment does not preclude purposeful action. However, the purpose is found in the action itself, not in the outcomes or destinations. For example, the purpose of a journey is the experience of traveling, not simply arriving at the destination. The purpose of climbing a mountain is the challenge and experience of climbing, not just reaching the summit. The youth says this view contradicts the philosopher's earlier rejection of focusing on the past. The philosopher clarifies that shining a spotlight on the present moment precludes seeing the past or future clearly. We imagine we see the past and future only because we cast a dim light on life as a whole. In truth, the past does not determine the present, and we cannot know the future. Focusing on the past or future is a way to avoid fully experiencing the present. The philosopher concludes that viewing life as a story determined by the past leads to a dim view of life and a tendency to avoid personal responsibility in the present. Life has no inherent meaning or purpose. We must assign our own meaning to life. The past and future do not actually exist, only the present moment exists. We should live earnestly in the present instead of dwelling on the past or future. To live meaningfully, we should focus on contributing to others. This gives us purpose and guidance. Even seemingly meaningless moments can be meaningful if we choose to make them so. Life's meaning comes from within, not from external circumstances. We should not be too serious or get caught up in objectives and destinations. We should simply dance through life and appreciate each moment. A life lived earnestly and meaningfully, focused on the present and on contributing to others, will lead to happiness and fulfillment. Though life brings hardship, we can choose to assign positive meaning even to negative events. Our perspective and choices determine our experience of life. In summary, the key message is that we must determine life's meaning for ourselves by focusing on living purposefully and meaningfully in the present moment, and orienting our lives around contributing to others. If we do so, we can find happiness and fulfillment. Life has the meaning we choose to give it. The speaker looks back on his life and says that no matter how hard he tries, he will never fully understand why he is here now. Though he originally studied Greek philosophy, he later began studying Adlerian psychology as well. He says the only way to explain how he ended up here is that he danced the moments, fully embracing the present. By doing so, the meaning of life becomes clear. The speaker says one person's power is immense. If an individual changes, the world will change. No one else will change the world for you. The world looks different to the speaker now that he has learned Adlerian psychology. It's like going from nearsighted to seeing clearly with glasses. The world becomes vivid and well-defined. The speaker tells the listener not to wish they knew this years ago. They needed to hear it now. He quotes Adler saying someone has to start. Other people might not be cooperative, but that is not connected to you. My advice is this: you should start. With no regard to whether others are cooperative or not. The listener says they can't tell yet if they or the world has changed, but the present moment is shining brightly. The speaker says they believe the listener has drunk the water, meaning embrace the teachings. The speaker invites the listener to walk together, and the listener agrees, thanking the speaker for their time. The listener says they hope to visit again as an irreplaceable friend, not to challenge the speaker's arguments. The speaker laughs and says the listener has finally shown a youthful smile. They bid each other good night and look forward to morning. The summary outlines learning Adlerian psychology from a philosopher, embracing living in the present moment, and gaining a new optimistic perspective of individual power to enact change. Though the teachings were challenging at first, the listener comes around to appreciating them. The process of learning and gaining wisdom through dialogue is important, even if one does not achieve complete wisdom. Platonic dialogues often end without a conclusion, focusing on the journey. This book follows that tradition, depicting a dialogue between a philosopher and a youth. The author became dissatisfied with only interpreting past philosophers' writings. He began practicing counseling and dialoguing with youths, who wanted to live sincerely but struggled with societal pressures and complicated relationships. Sincerity is important but not enough. One needs wisdom to build good relationships, communicate well, and live one's own life. The philosopher argues that happiness is simple and available to all. His philosophy, though antithetical to typical thinking, shows how to improve relationships through practical steps. The book resulted from years of dialogues between the author and his collaborator, who aimed to convey the author's teachings as Plato conveyed Socrates'. The youth in the dialogue represents the reader, who may doubt but finds support in solving life's problems. Discussion questions address rejecting trauma, interpersonal relationships as the source of problems, disregarding others' opinions, freedom through being disliked, finding purpose and community, acknowledging human imperfection, finding meaning in labor, and living in the present. Activities include meditation, Socratic dialogue, and mindful nature walking to enhance understanding and practice of the book's concepts. The authors are an Adlerian psychologist and counselor, and a writer, from Kyoto. The psychologist writes, lectures on, and provides counseling in Adlerian psychology, especially for youth in psychiatric clinics. Ichiro Kishimi is a Japanese psychologist known for translating Alfred Adler's works into Japanese and writing books on Adlerian psychology. Fumitake Koga is a Japanese author who has written many best-selling business and non-fiction books. He was introduced to Adlerian psychology in his late 20s and was deeply influenced by its unconventional ideas. He visited Ichiro Kishimi many times to learn about Adlerian psychology. Together, Kishimi and Koga wrote The Courage to be Disliked using the dialogue format of ancient Greek philosophy. The book aims to show readers how to change their lives and achieve happiness. The authors argue for freeing oneself from the shackles of self-centered tendencies and gaining a more objective perspective on life. They discuss concepts such as inferiority complex, superiority complex, and the importance of social connections. The core message is about finding the courage to overcome anxieties and accept one's imperfections. Book link: click here.